let's get on with the program. I'm going to talk about industrial hemp and what are some of the prospects and challenges for this new old crop. And when I say that, why is it a new old crop? We've had quite a long history with it, and yet we've been kind of denied the opportunity to work with it for a while. So just a bit of outline. This probably needs a little bit of revision, but why are people interested? I'd like to give a little bit about the history and the mythology and the realities of this crop. I'll discuss some of the potential uses. Also, we'll talk not so much heavy on data, but just give some sense of some of the things that we've seen. And as far as Virginia's plans, we are fortunate to have Erin Williams from the Virginia Department of Ag and Consumer Services with us this morning so that she can talk about where we are on the regulatory end. So this is difficult for me to do remotely as I can't gauge my audience, but typically I throw up this slide and I said from an interest standpoint, that's enough said. So hopefully you got a little chuckle out of that. I'm moving on. When we consider hemp through human history, it's estimated that we probably harvested this crop about 8,500 years ago. Let me ask again some feedback there. If your system is not muted, please do so. So we have a long history of use, and it's estimated that cultivation started about 4,000 years ago. The material in terms of its adaptation or where origin, where it first evolved, is thought to have been in Central Asia. And that material is going to spread east and it will spread west. And there are several different types of hemp. There's kind of a broad-leafed hemp type. There's a broad-leafed drug type, narrow-leafed hemp type, narrow-leaf drug types. And there's a lot of debate, discussion about what do you call these materials? Are they different species? Are they the same species? For our intents and purposes, they are really the same thing. They've been bred to different endpoints. They have some different genetic modifications perhaps that lead to that kind of different leaf shape, that sort of thing. But really, we consider all of this cannabis sativa. There may be a subspecies designation for some of it, etc. The plant coming out of Central Asia will go east into China, and the Chinese grew it for fiber as well as for food, and probably for ritual and medicinal uses. And it also spread into Europe. And the Europeans were using largely what's a narrow-leafed hemp type. It would have generally been fairly low in cannabinoids, although not completely non-existent in those plant materials. Much of the hemp industry was in sort of northern Europe, maybe down to France. And the Spanish tried to grow it, but weren't real successful with it. So they took it with them when they went to the New World, to the Western Hemisphere. And so that's how you get that import into Chile. The Chileans still have a long-standing, very small-scale hemp for fiber industry. Hemp was cultivated in New England in the 1600s, and many of you have probably heard the kind of advocacy statement that, hemp is so important that colonists had to grow it in Virginia, and, by law, they had to do that. And that sounds great until you ask your question, when's the last time you were happy to do what the government told you you had to do? It was an obligation to make sure that there were materials available for the crown. And why is that? So if you look at the last bullet, cannabis and canvas, you can recognize the similarity of those names. Canvas made from hemp was very strong, and that was very useful for the British Navy. Hemp was grown in Virginia through the Revolutionary War, and was an important crop. Some were hoping that it would be competitive with tobacco, but it never really was able to do that in Virginia, and the industry would move west into Kentucky. And interestingly, that was largely well, it's interestingly and sadly, it was on the back of slave labor. And the use for the hemp was largely in twine and rope, things like that, to bundle up cotton that was being grown further south. There's a long, very interesting and tortured history with hemp in terms of power dimensions and dynamics among peoples in Europe and in the New World. The industry would decline in the face of steamships and cheap fibers. Metal staples became the way to hold cotton bales together. With steamships, you don't need a sail. We were able to import cheaper fibers from Asia and other places like that. And so, many people throw up conspiracy theories about, other industries that were trying to suppress the production of hemp. And while I'm sure that other industries may have been happy to see hemp go by the wayside, there's no data or information in the literature that I've read that would clearly signal that there was some vast conspiracy to keep hemp from, being competitive, say with cotton or timber. In the 30s, the Congress passed the Marijuana Tax Act. The President Roosevelt and others were concerned about the use of cannabis for recreational purposes. And so all cannabis cultivation goes under U.S. Treasury control. The two aren't really distinguished in cannabis versus hemp. It was just all treated, with broad brushstrokes. So although that Marijuana Tax Act really kind of starts the serious demise of the industry, just from a regulatory purpose, the U.S. government gets back into the hemp business, as it were, with a Hemp for Victory campaign in the 40s because of the Japanese colonization of South Asia and the loss of those cheap fiber sources. The U.S. was concerned that we still needed ropes for naval vessels and things like that, and so they were reinvesting in this Grow Hemp for Victory campaign. Those markets and opportunities disappeared at the end of the war, and they were further constrained by the passage of the Controlled Substance Act, and the CSA really the CSA turns all cannabis materials really into Schedule 1, and so just very difficult to work with. That said, the Europeans, particularly in the East, still had some hemp operations going, and there's a resurgence of interest in the 90s that kind of comes out of Europe and into Canada. And so, it's taken a couple of decades really until we got to the 2014 Farm Bill that allowed for university research with states that had research programs. And then the most recent 2018 Farm Bill has opened the door for hemp production. This is a graphic that I've shown actually since about 2014. You can see the number of states. It's kind of a moot point at this time, given the opening up with the new federal legislation. But you can see the growing interest and rapid change in terms of the number of states that are looking at hemp. So there's I've kind of already pointed a little bit at some of the mythology from the idea that, it was so important that you had to grow it. There's some other myths that you'll hear, the founding fathers smoked it. There's no evidence of that. The Constitution in a draft form and some of our other formative documents may have been written on some hemp papers, but the Constitution is written on parchment, which is lambskin. This next one is a great one. I've gotten a few phone calls where people will call me up and tell me, hemp is so great that it doesn't require any inputs, no fertilizers, herbicides, whatever. And, I don't say, but I'm always thinking, okay, how many cornflakes did you need to pick up the phone and call me? There's no such thing as a free lunch, and everything has some kind of input requirements. It's got to have some sort of fertility or nutrient. The next bullet, it can grow on marginal soils. That's really not a myth. That is true. But I will say it will be a marginal crop if you grow it on a marginal soil. The statement about the following crop being your best ever, that may be possible with certain production systems. For example, if you're growing fiber and you leave those plants laying in the field to rot, very likely that many of those nutrients that were in that plant will return to the soil along with the carbon that was accumulated over the season, and that might very well be beneficial. But if you're harvesting those materials and you're taking it all off the field, why would you expect it to improve the productivity the subsequent season? So we just don't have a lot of good data on that. It's possible some people have considered that hemp may have some beneficial effect relative to detrimental nematodes, but again, we just don't have good evidence for that at this point. It is broadly adapted. The plant is broadly adapted. It's also day length sensitive. And what that means is it will respond, its growth pattern will respond not based on a certain sort of calendar date, but it responds to sunlight. And that's why this next bullet, it says it grows 3 to 20 feet tall. There's some of that height is based on the light signal that the plant gets. And typically what happens if you take a plant from a southern latitude and you move it north, it doesn't get the short day signal that tells it to go to flower until much later in the season. And so that allows for more vegetative growth and taller plants. And you can imagine if you had a grain plant that you moved north, it might get too tall to harvest. That would be a problem. In the same way, if you had fiber plants, so we have tested some materials from Ukraine that are supposedly fiber plants, but the Ukrainian latitude is probably up in the mid-50s or something. And when you bring it to our region in the mid-30s, that plant grows up, looks great coming out of the ground, and then it stops because it's got the light signal to go to flower, and it won't get as tall as, say, fiber plants from someplace like Italy or something like that. Stalk diameter is, that's that range of 1/2 to 2 inches is really variable depending on not only the plant genetics, but also on the management. And I'll show you a little bit of the management difference here in a minute. We typically would grow a high density planting for fiber and sort of low or moderate density for grain. Some people do kind of a dual purpose crop where they're trying to get both fiber and grain. And then we have low density plantings, most typically for the flowers. Now, I mentioned flowers. Hemp is a monoecious or a dioecious plant. And those 50-cent words mean is monoecious. That means one plant for both sexes. So you would have both male and female flowers on a monoecious plant. Or hemp will be dioecious. And that means you have 2 plants, and so you've got a male plant and a female plant. And in the flower industry, we are often trying to have female plants, but sometimes they will do what in the pot world is called, I'm told I got to be current. We don't say pot anymore. We say weed. In the weed world, they'll go hermy on you. So they would hermaphrodite. Those plants, if they don't get fertilized, may actually create a male flower, so that they can, in fact, make seed. So, a lot of the interest behind this, if you look back at, there was a Popular Mechanics article in the 30s, and they claimed, that hemp would be the next the first billion-dollar crop, which kind of ironic since that article came out just after the Marijuana Tax Act. But when they were talking about that, they were talking about hemp in the context of seed and the fiber production. And the seeds can be used in a variety of products, whether that's food or flowers, or you can crush the oils out and put them into that, or personal care products or industrial products like paint. And the fibers, we generally would break out into 2 different fractions. You would have the long fiber. The long fiber is where you have this very high strength, lightweight material. Among natural fibers, hemp has one of the highest strength to weight ratios. And then there's also the hurd, which can be put into a variety of products. And I'll demonstrate a little bit of that in just a minute. Let's see here. So I mentioned the monoecious versus dioecious. If you look in this slide A, or this picture A, you see the dioecious plants here. There's a male plant on the left and a female on the right. You see the male is much more slender and the female is much more robust. And then under section B, you can see these were plants that were, they're shorter in form and they have a more dense flower head that's kind of grown for low density narcotic. And I would say that a lot of our flowers in general, so if we're growing these for CBD, many of those plants really are derived from narcotic strains, but they have been bred to have very little THC. The oilseed crops are, probably a little bit more open, although I haven't seen any of these kinds of varieties under this kind of management in the U.S. at this point. When we look at the fiber crops, typically those are grown, as I mentioned earlier, at very high density. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to encourage these plants to grow up instead of spread out. And because you want less branching and you want longer distance between internodes. So I don't want a stem here, a stem here, a stem there, and that creates shorter lengths or shorter runs of fiber and reduces the fiber quality. Our oilseed production has looked more at this kind of moderate density planting and would look more like this, folks that are working to create dual purpose crops. So you have kind of a moderate density again. Again, it goes back to variety. This last picture with the cross sections is a little bit, perhaps a little bit misleading because there probably is some large difference or some potential difference among the different strains, but that's also a function of maturity. So as these plants go to flower, they will start to fill in with this kind of whiter material in the center here that we call that hurd, or as a kid I would have called it pith, but that gives that stem greater strength to stand up and hold a seed head, and that's why that happens. So this is just another depiction of that. You see this picture from the left is quite commonly found on the web. And you see the long fibers, as I try to demonstrate this, the long fibers, again, you can imagine this is my hemp stem. And that would be where on the inside, where I had all of the pith or hurd. And if this plant's growing up in the field, then I've got these long, vast fibers that, like my fingers, would be running up the outside. So in this picture, they've just peeled away those fibers and they've left that core or hurd. And then you can see kind of the cross section in that cartoon of that. So now, what do we do with some of these fibers? Well, again, 25,000 uses, right? But one of the uses for the long fibers has been in home construction, and typically being put into things like some sort of natural insulation products. We also see hemp using the short fibers in home construction in products. You may well have heard of Hempcrete, and that's simply a mixture of those short fibers blended with Portland cement. And just as kind of an aside, this Hempcrete, this kind of yellow home down here in the lower right, that's a house that was built in Asheville. They had a special needs child that was quite sensitive to toxins in the environment. The Hempcrete is supposed to be absorbent and capable of absorbing volatile organic compounds like aldehydes, things like that would come off of varnishes or furniture, that sort of thing. And it's also supposed to absorb moisture, so you have a more stable relative humidity and you have a cleaner environment. And so that was their purpose in building that. We also have had a Hempcrete home built in Virginia. Just to kind of go through the process real quickly, in the lower left, you have a form. You pour the Hempcrete in there, and then you let that set up. And then you, after it has cured, you put your forms up the next level or layer and pour some more. So it's kind of a little bit more tedious process. It's not a load-bearing structure, but it's, again, very strong and has a lot of insulating capacity. And so this is just shows you that home. You can see the walls here where they have had the Hempcrete poured for that house.
Morning.
Good morning. So let's see here. The natural fibers have also been embedded in polymer resins. This picture here shows a door panel, I guess, or a part of a panel that was put, I think, into this Lotus Echo, the hemp car. If you look back into YouTube, you can find the pictures of Henry Ford hitting a hemp car, something he had built with hemp materials, hitting it with a sledgehammer, and it just kind of bounces off and doesn't break or dent. And I was reading recently that Porsche is actually building fins for its cars and making some other components with natural fibers. They're actually using flax, but this is something that the industry would like to do. I think, again, BMW and Mercedes are making door panels with these types of materials. They want to reduce their carbon footprint. They want something that's easier to work with, perhaps, than the fibers, and so that's part of their game. The nanosheets for supercapacitors, I'm not going to spend a lot of time trying to explain that, but the thought is that hemp fibers and other fibers can be used in creation of supercapacitors, so we have better batteries, I guess I would say. Some of you expressed interest in hemp for grain, and the grain is an interesting one. It's very high in fatty acids, that 27 to 38% oil, and it has a very positive fatty acid profile. It has alpha-linolenic acid, and it's the only natural gamma-linolenic acid source that we have among potential grain products. All of our other stuff does not have that. I was talking to a colleague recently, and he said the only other place he could easily get it in the not too distant past was from evening primrose. The omega-3 to omega-6 fatty acid ratio is about 3 to 1, and that's considered very good for human health. But suffice it to say that the human health literature with hemp oil from seeds is actually very limited. It is finding some use in cosmetics. I was in New Zealand in 2017, and while there, I was talking with some folks in the industry that were growing hemp seed specifically because of the anti-inflammatory effects of some of these fatty acids. And so they had a company that wanted a specific variety that was high, I think, in gamma-linolenic acid, and that was their end point, was to be able to say our products have these anti-inflammatory capacities. So it is finding use in cosmetics and sort of home healthcare products, but the economic potential for this stuff is as yet undefined. I will call your attention to the picture. You'll see there's a dime there, and so you can see the seed are fairly small if you've not had experience with them. Generally, seed counts are probably 22 to 25 or 27,000 seed per pound. The other thing I'll point out is we call these seed. That's not quite true. For our purposes, seed is fine, but the seed is really on the inside. You're seeing the hull, and it's kind of like it's like a miniature sunflower seed in a sense. So what we call the true seed is really the piece inside of the hull. There's also been some looking at hemp as a forage, and I think it may have some potential for that, but I won't belabor this at this point. Many, if not most of you, are interested in hemp as a medicinal crop, and what you're really trying to do is grow these plants for the cannabinoids that are found in the bracts and leaves of the plant tissue. So I'm going to kind of walk through this looking from left to right. You'll see this long stalk with flowers on it, and you'll see some leaf tissue kind of projecting off of that stalk, but it's mostly flowers there. And in the marijuana world, that would be called a cola, and that is becoming the terminology in the hemp world too. One of the guy who grew this for me, he was in Pennsylvania County, and he said somebody he interacted with was calling marijuana left-handed hemp. So if it's hemp, left-handed or right-handed, fine. Either way, this is the cola. This has the flowers, and what people are doing with this is they are harvesting these materials typically as a whole plant. They're drying it down, and then they will strip all of the flower off of that stem. And that's what the industry wants. So that's what the market wants, is those flowers. Why are they interested in the flowers? Well, if you look in the middle slide, you see the leaves that are attendant to the flower have a lot of little white spots on them. And those white spots are called trichomes. And these trichomes are little glandular organs that synthesize the cannabinoids. So if we look in the last picture, it's maybe a little bit indistinct, but there's a lot of trichomes. You can see that on this leaf surrounding that seed. So that leaf surrounding the seed is called a bract. And the bracts really have the highest concentration of trichomes. Now, you also see there are trichomes on the leaf tissue, and that's all well and good, but we really would like to have this bract, and we would like to not have this seed. Typically, if you're familiar with the left-handed hemp term sin semilla, that's I think out of Spanish, which means without seed. And so what you really would like to do is grow these plants such that they don't get fertilized, so that you don't have any seed. Now, why is that? If the plant is growing a seed, then it's diverting energy to seed production. And if it doesn't have that seed, it can put more energy into resin production. The other aspect of that is, since people growing for flowers are being paid on the concentration of cannabinoids in the plant material, having a seed not only reduces the amount of cannabinoids that plant synthesizes, it also dilutes those cannabinoids because you have a lot of seed there. And in some cases, we've stripped some flowers out that were seeded, and the seeds made up almost half of the weight. So that could have a substantial impact on product quality. Different approaches. I guess maybe I should step away there a second. Hemp is a medicinal crop. Many of you have heard of the term CBD. You may not have heard the term cannabidiol. CBD is it's the acronym for cannabidiol. There are other cannabinoids in this crop. Some of you may have heard of CBG, CBN. There are over 100 cannabinoids synthesized by hemp. THC is another one that you're very familiar with, and that is the psychotropic agent in marijuana or left-handed hemp. And so it's the one that we worry about from a regulatory standpoint. But I would say CBD is really kind of changing the debate around the use of hemp and marijuana, really, because marijuana also has CBD in it. CBD is non-psychoactive, and it has a wide range of medicinal benefits. Not to go over all the 50-cent words here, but just looking at some of the effects that have been shown either in clinical trials or at the very least empirically. Hemp is known to reduce nausea and vomiting. It can suppress seizures. Many of you may be familiar with GW Pharmaceuticals, which has gotten the license or the permission to sell Epidiolex, which is an anti-seizure medicine for epilepsy. And a number of you are probably familiar with a product called Charlotte's Web. Charlotte was a little girl who had severe seizures and was getting great benefit from hemp extract, CBD oil, and they named that product after her, or one of their products after her. Going on through the list, the CBD and cannabinoids may combat psychosis disorders and inflammatory disorders. I had a sore joint one time, no pun intended. I had a sore joint one time. I was at a hemp conference. Somebody had some CBD oil. They said, well, try this on that. I rubbed it on, and it was almost instantaneous. The pain was gone. Now, I will say the pain came back a little bit. I put a little bit more on. I hardly had any trouble with the joint after that. So that's a sample size of one, just empirical evidence, but my own personal experience is that it is useful. Neurodegenerative disorders, we've already mentioned the seizure activity. Parkinson's patients, I've had a number of people tell me that they have given these materials to people with Parkinson's, and they get a great deal of relief from that, and much less palsy and that sort of thing. Tumor and cancer cells, anxiety, depression, a number of these disorders can be combated apparently with these cannabinoids. So people looking to grow hemp for flowers are typically taking kind of a tobacco or vegetable model for their production system. And I'm going to point out a couple of potential problems with these slides. The picture on the left is from Kentucky, and I'm guessing that that's about 3 feet between the rows. That's probably too close, and they're a couple of feet apart within a row, and I'm saying I think that's too close. The other kind of vegetable model is in like this lower right picture. A lot of times in the vegetable model, people are using what's called a bedder, and they're bedding up the soil, and they're covering that in plastic mulch, and they've got drip irrigation tape that's under that mulch to water those plants. So sometimes you'll hear that called plastic culture. And so that's a fairly common approach. Some people use black, some people use white. Folks that I have talked to from industry typically say white, and I think that would be maybe dependent on what part of the world you live in, but you really don't want the roots to get too hot in this crop, and so white is probably better since it's reflective. The failing perhaps in this picture is all of the vegetation that's growing between the rows of plants. It's not bad to have that ground covered, but when it gets big like this grass plant here or these grasses in the back, that reduces airflow, and those plants may be competing with the hemp plants for nutrients. And so the airflow is kind of important because of the plant can be subject to mold. Some varieties are more sensitive than others, and keeping the air flowing around those plants is useful to reduce those mold pressures. So there are a number of research needs, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about all those. I will show you a few things that I think may be informative. One is site suitability. Again, we've said that hemp, kind of mythologically can grow on any sort of place, and yes, it may well grow in marginal soils, but it may do so marginally. And this is an example from Blacksburg. You see Jabari and another student, they were out looking at a hemp stand, and you see this kind of soil here where it's a bit reddish. And in that reddish soil, those plants just did not get up as quickly and as thriftily as the plants in our darker, loamier soil. That's not to say that those plants didn't come on. They did. We didn't get yield differences from the red to the brown soil, but soil quality is important. If you have a heavy clay soil, that may be challenging. I was reading sort of an anecdotal evidence from a paper last night where they suggested if you have sandy soils, your plants may be subject to having higher levels of THC. So there's that's kind of questionable, and part of that's probably related to plant stress. So those are things that people need to be aware of and think about in their management. The other picture here is from Waynesboro. This was planted as a grain planting. They started at the beginning of the season, planted this site wall to wall. It was looking good, and then we had all of the deluges that we experienced last summer. And so we found these wet zones because the hemp just did not do well in those wet sites. So if you have poorly drained soils or very heavy clay soils, those are things to give some consideration to. Just going back to the kind of the soil quality, this is from a first-year planting. We were just simply looking at biomass. These are not cannabinoid varieties. This is just, Canda is a grain or dual-purpose crop. Felina is the same. Carmignola and Fibrinova are Italian lines that are used for fiber. And so just as a comparison between Orange, Virginia, which has a heavy clay soil, and our Blacksburg site, which is a more of a loam, you can see that we had, 4 times the tonnage from Orange to Blacksburg with Canda, and 3 times the tonnage or more with these other plant materials. And so that's a big difference. So another thing that should be noted, we planted in Orange probably a week or maybe 10 days before we planted in Blacksburg, just because of when we could get stuff into the ground, that sort of thing. So Blacksburg is a little cooler, and we may have had a little better precipitation. I'd have to go back and look at that. But those soil types, I think, have a real effect on the plant productivity. The idea that it has doesn't need any nutrients or won't, respond to fertilizers, again, is kind of false. The TPA, I'm sorry, I should have stated, that is tons per acre. And this is work from the southern Piedmont, probably a sandy cap over a clay loam. And just looking at, again, total biomass and responsive to nitrogen, not a real strong response, but clearly it was continuing to respond to nitrogen inputs in that system. So we do need more information on cultivars. The picture you see in front of you has a set of border plots. I should have stepped past those to take the actual cultivar plots here. And these are largely grain plots in this picture. And you can see some large difference in cultivars just in terms of how they're getting out of the ground. There is a potential challenge too with seedling vigor. This blank spot was a variety that had low germinability. We upped the planting rate to deal with the low germ, but the seedlings obviously had low vigor as well. And so those plots just did not do well. This is, again, not what you're going to do in a flower system, but just want you to be aware that there are certainly differences in cultivars and their response. Another thing I might point out, this is another field that was planted just with a grain or sort of dual purpose variety, and you can see it's being overwhelmed by Johnson grass there. So, management for these crops will be important. To that end, let me discuss establishment just a little bit. These are just pictures from around the state. We typically talk about hemp as needing a firm, well-tilled seed bed, and that may or may not be true. But we're working to see if we can use a no-till to get these established. And part of what we do is we throw a grid down and see, do we have plants in these cells or not? And so you can see some large differences here in site condition. One of the other things that we've looked at is planting rate. And again, these are just kind of limited studies. I don't want to get you too deep into data, but this is something I want you to think about, particularly if you're interested in growing grain. So these are largely grain crops, and from our variety trial, and we took two varieties that were Canadian. One is CFX, the other Joey, and we planted them at 20, 30, or 40 pounds per acre. And so then we went back and we used that grid, like I was talking about, and we got an estimate of percent stand. And you see that there's really not much difference between 30 and 40 pounds per acre. Both of those look better than 20. And that's true in both of these, or for both of these varieties. Now, when we went back and looked at stems per meter squared, as planting rate goes up, stems per meter squared goes up for both of these. However, if we looked at the biomass coming off those plots, it's clear that this moderate rate of planting gave us a much better yield just in terms of total biomass than when we planted at the higher or lower rates. So, we have some work to do to figure out how to best manage these plants. And one of the things that we've done is, we've typically planted on a pounds per acre basis, and that's probably not the best approach. If you're interested in growing grain, you probably need to think about this more in terms of plants per acre or seeds per linear foot, or some sort of method like that. And I'll skip that one. That's just some fiber yield results. I mentioned that we were trying some tillage versus no-till. And so this shows you a tillage fiber versus tillage grain and a no-till grain. And, So let's look at the numbers real quickly. We do think the no-till will work, but it will probably be more successful for fiber production. In the grain systems with tillage, we had a 90% stand. We had about 100 stems per meter squared, and roughly 2 tons per acre. When we looked at it under no-till, and I just have this broken out in 2 numbers for this one metric, this percent stand, 63% stand when we counted all plots. There was one plot where we did not have good grass weed control, and if I took that one plot out, I could get it up to 74%. Still a substantial discount relative to tillage, but we think we can get there. Again, far fewer stems and less tonnage. In the fiber systems, we're planting at twice the rate, so 30 pounds per acre for grain, 60 pounds per acre for tillage, and you see that our stand percents and our stems and our biomass are much more comparable in that kind of setting. I mentioned that where you get the seed affects its sensitivity to sunlight, or it affects its photoperiodicity. And so when we plant that material and where it comes from will have some effects on how productive it will be. You can see in some of these plots, these materials are greening up at different times. Weed pressure is going to be a real issue, I think, for some people growing for grain, that sort of thing. And some of that will get down to just good agronomics. I mean, if we plant at a wrong time, we'll have a challenge. So this is a picture from Waynesboro where the hemp was grown or it was planted late in the season. And that was because they had seed that they needed to do something with, and they didn't want to take it and put it in storage. So they just said, well, let's put it in the ground. And I think that was planted in late June or maybe even early July. And you'll see the grass is kind of laying down where my cursor is going back and forth. That all fell down after a big heavy rain event. And so the little kind of spiky stuff that you see, that's the hemp that was left standing. So it is quite strong, or can be, but you would not have seen that hemp very well or very easily in that field but for that rain event. Also, for grain and fiber growers, we don't really have any recommendations that we can make relative to herbicides. My colleague, Michael Flessner, has worked with me some and has really led the charge in evaluating different herbicides. You can see the hemp in this plot that's kind of drooping next to a plot that was not. This plant has been treated with an herbicide that affected the pigmentation. You see some of these other plants that have taken it pretty hard. Again, grain or fiber systems may or may not need that input, and it's going to be a function of how well you manage, I think. But if you're not muted, please do. Looking at pest pressures, hemp is a real attractant to a number of different insect species. We've seen marmorated stink bug, tiger moth caterpillar. The Japanese beetles, I don't think will do much in the way of damaging your crop, but they really, really, really like the male flowers. The bigger challenge is going to, please be like, the bigger challenge is going to be with things like the yellow striped armyworm, fall armyworm, and corn earworm. These chewing creatures really like to get into those seed heads and eat flowers. Disease is going to be an issue. These pictures are largely from flower grows, and sorry, folks. I just want to. Yeah, that's all muted now. Okay. Hopefully that's cleared up. All right. So I wanted to finish this one. So we have seen botrytis septoria. I don't think is really a big issue relative to plant productivity. It may be if you're trying to market a material that has some leaf tissue on it and you don't want any sort of fungus present there just from a presentation standpoint. The fusarium bud rot is really often a consequence of having had insect pressure, boring, those chewing insects get into that bud material, and that opens that plant up for invasion from the fusarium. And fusarium may be an issue relative to mycotoxins, and depending on how your processor is processing this material. Some folks tell me they're not too worried about some of this mold that might come about with some of these some of this damage, but others would not take that kind of material. Going back to grain, people interested in grain. This is a crop from Caroline County a couple of years ago, and it looks pretty nice, but they were not really able to harvest it because hemp has not been selected to have low shatter. And so when they brought the combine into it, they actually had sprayed it with a crop aid. I don't remember if it was gramoxone or glyphosate, but they had sprayed it with something to help it dry down. And when they got the combine to the field, it just shattered out. And people are generally harvesting this stuff with about, it's probably somewhere between 50 and 70% maturity, which means you're probably about 20% moisture. And if you harvest it at that moisture to prevent the shatter loss, that's fine, but you need to get it out of the field as soon as possible. And when you take it back to a grain bin, you need to have a dryer on the auger because you're not going to be able to blow enough air through these little BBs of seed in the bottom of the bin to get it dried down. So you really need to heat it up going into the bin to get it dried. This is a picture from Waynesboro again. Somebody had, they had those plants in that kind of field I showed you. And it was looking good until moisture set in September, and you had these, you see these white lines here. That's just roots where that plant had started to germinate on the stalk. And this is a flower grow that we had in Roanoke, and it's got the same sort of thing happening where it's starting to germinate. That's really not a big issue for us, but the bigger issue in a flower setting is we don't want that seed. Real quickly thinking about some of these crops in Europe, I think they're doing a lot of this as kind of a dual purpose, and they might be taking, so they have created some modified equipment, and they have the capacity to raise the combine head up high, and then they have a conveyor that puts the material back into a receiving vessel, and they're probably extracting this stuff for CBD, or they could turn it into silage, use it as some kind of feed, and then they would come back and harvest the stalks. This is a picture of an American made machine, I guess, that's got the same sort of modifications, essentially taking a tractor, putting a combine head on it with the conveyor, and also being able to cut the stalk at the same time. So lots of questions about where we go with these systems as people try to turn hemp into a 2 or 3 use crop. Others of you that may be interested in fiber, talked with folks at Sunstrand, which is our closest processor there in Kentucky. Sunstrand says they are having people cut with a sickle bar mower. The picture in the top shows somebody's modification of, I guess really not modification, but a new system. This is actually in the UK, and it's got 3 sickle bars, and they're cutting this material, I guess, to make it easier to deal with. Sunstrand's recommendations on fiber production are cut with a sickle bar, let it sit in the field and ret, and then you would ted it a couple of times. So the tedder is just spreading the stuff around so that it kind of rets evenly. And after a couple of passes with the tedder, and you're also beating off the leaves and flower stems, small stems, that sort of thing, then you would rake it up and bale it. Now, I use this term retting. Some of you may not be familiar with that. These are some plants from the southern Piedmont, and it just shows what the plants look like after they have laid in the field for a little bit. Retting is just kind of another word for rotting. And what's happening in that process. If you remember, I had the core fibers, and those core fibers are bound to the bast fibers that grow up on the outside of the stalk, but they're bound by a layer of pectin. And, pectin is stuff that we put in jellies to make a thickening agent, that sort of thing. Well, these pectins will be degraded by microbial action. And so what we are trying to do then is give that microbial community an opportunity to consume or break down those pectins. And then those long fibers will be easily broken away from the short inner fibers. And just incidentally, this is not redded fully yet. Probably those plants will look a more chocolatey color when they're ready. Flower production. So again, I think this is probably going to be the majority of the audience. The picture on the top left is from a grow, hand planted, not bedded, just tilled and put it in the ground. This is in Southwest Virginia. This is the edge of the Shenandoah Valley site. And again, it's bedded, not the best deal per se to have a lot of vegetation in here unless you can find kind of a low growing ground cover. And then this is what this bottom picture is what those plants looked like at the time of harvest. And then we did take those plants and hang them in the barn. Having a barn space to handle this material is going to be critical. I've had a number of people say, we want to grow 50 acres or 30 acres or 100 acres. And one person I've talked to says, look, you probably ought to calculate somewhere between 25 and 50% of your land area. You need to have that same sort of space in barn area to get this stuff dried. Now, there are ways to do it with less space. You may have a tobacco bulk barn. You may have access to some sort of warehouse and you can run fans through it. You may have material that comes out early and you can get that in to a drying system and get it out and then bring in later material. There are ways to manage some of that, but that's going to be an important consideration. And just the last thing, I kind of mentioned this, re-hit this point with flower production. We are going to see issues with these pests. Some of that will depend on timing. So if it's a late maturing material, it may go to flower after the insect cycle has passed. But if it doesn't and you have this bud rot, you're going to have challenges there. A few realities, and I've got another table on this later that I'll try to put together to take a look at, but a few realities to account. Seeds are anywhere from 15 cents to $2 a piece right now, and I've seen clones 3 to 10. Actually, it's some even higher than that. We're typically telling people, plant 12 or 1,500 per acre. Some people are trying higher than that. I think you run real risks of issues with mold in the field. Again, how do I prep this site? Do I clean till it or do I bed it? What's my transplant system? Do I do it by hand or do I have a planter? Do I irrigate? All of these factors are things you need to think about if you want to grow flowers, and you think about the labor that's going to take. Some other quick considerations. Some people are trying to do organic grow. So interestingly enough, we can spray copper sulfate, an inorganic compound. We can spray that on hemp to help reduce herbicide, but hemp is entering the smokables market. And so, if you're smoking something that's got copper sulfate on it and you're getting that in your lungs, that's probably not a great idea. I would also want to urge some caution. We don't have any data on CBD use during gestation or lactation. And some people say, safe for anybody, anytime, anywhere. So, well, I'd be careful about that because we know these compounds affect brain function and probably form in some cases. FDA still plans to regulate, so that brings some questions into how do we manage this. And we'll get more about THC thresholds and state oversight when Ms. Williams talks to us. Markets and payments. For those of you who want to grow, I would strongly encourage you to find brokers. They have a variety of different payment mechanisms and variation in the support that they supply or provide. And, if you get a contract, get a couple of them, hold them side by side and see what people are offering. Many people from who grew 2018 still have not been paid. There has not been enough process capacity to handle the material. And so when we go to 2019 and there's a 100-fold increase in acres, I know a number of people are working hard to bring processors in, but real questions about that. And this issue of the value can increase for those who can store it. The first deluge that comes into the process facility at the end of the growing season is going to lower or put a downward pressure on the prices. And so if you have capacity to store it, it may be worth your while. This is a real question. I throw this up for everyone to consider. 20 years ago, probably, people were selling emu breeding pairs for $10,000 or maybe $20,000 a pair. And it just became a big pyramid scheme. And, suddenly there were emus running loose on the landscape because nobody had anything they could do with them. And I think it really, if you want to get in, and I'm not saying yay or nay, but I would really encourage you to think about what's the potential scale. Will supply outstrip demand? I'm optimistic about some of these things, but we've been here with this sort of thing before. And this is not flowers. This is Canadian grain acres after hemp was legalized there. Farmers got in a big way. They got almost 15,000 hectares. And so that's, 45,000 acres or something, 40,000 acres. And they were very, keen on this, but they had no markets. And so acres dropped, and then they've gone up and down. And I think they're kind of on an upward trajectory, but it's going to take a little time for the markets to develop and work themselves out. We don't have, if you're interested in putting this into an existing cropping system, we don't really have good answers right now about where some of these things will fit. I have some ideas. We're kind of short on time, so I want to move on. General recommendations. If you're growing for feed or food grain, typically you want well-drained, low-clay soil, moderate pH, and P and K similar to corn. If you're going to do that, I would suggest you look at the French monoecious varieties at this point, and you probably want to get this in the ground late April, early May. And we're typically looking at 9 or 10 germinable seed per linear foot. And then again, you've got issues with where do you, how do you manage the storage? Bottom line, though, folks, is still the bottom line. Our markets are limited. There's some folks in Kentucky that are processing hemp grain, but you'd have to ship your material there. So, do you have a place? Can you get a contract for delivering grain? Looking at the fiber side of this, some of the Chinese and Southern European dioecious lines probably look a little better. Again, getting them into the ground May or earlier. The Ukrainians tell me they plant mid-March. I'm not sure we could do that here. We ought to try. Those seeding rates are going to be twice as high as the grain rates. And, so if you're paying $6 a pound or something like that for fiber, and you're planting 60 pounds per acre, you got $360 just in the cost of the seed. And I don't think it'll be that expensive, over the long haul. Some companies are actually providing the seed, but those companies aren't in Virginia. Typically with these grain planting row spacings, we have just worked off the 7.5-inch spacing at the lower seeding rate for the grain, and we're doing the same thing with the fiber. There are some folks that have looked at 15 or even 30-inch row spacings on the grain, and that may work if you get it in the ground early enough so that you don't have a lot of weed pressure. But if you don't, you're going to have weed pressure issues. So, and again, we're back to this question of who's going to buy this crop. When we look at flowers, a number of the questions relative to site quality are the same as for grain or for fiber. You do have questions of, do I use cultivars? Where do they come from? Excuse me, not do I use cultivars, but what cultivars? Should I use feminized seed or clones? How do I prepare that land? You might plant as late as July when some of these flowers can be just fine. In some cases, you don't necessarily want a 20-foot tall flower crop. That's going to be hard to manage. You would want to scout this for insects as well as for THC, and you're going to start the harvest when you're at about the 0.3 range. And if you've got 5 acres and you got to cut it all by hand and it's 0.3 and you got to get it, you're going to need labor in time to do it. Typically low temperature with air movement is, our recommendation on drying. I think we'll have probably more better recommendations in the future. Post-harvest, you're looking at bucking or shucking or essentially just stripping the leaves off. And if you can use mechanization for that, that's better. So just kind of put a flower production in perspective. If I've got clones that are 3 to 12, and I had a friend who said he was going to get some for 150, and you say, whoa, that's a real high CBD, supposedly nil THC plant that they will use to make their own clones, as it were. But 8's typical. If you planted 1,200 plants per acre, you'd be talking $10,000 acre invested in plant material with clones before you did anything else. So, count the cost before you jump into this. If you go with seed, and let's take this average of $1 a seed for a feminized material, then you're talking $1,200 per acre. Now, I could use that cheaper 15-cent seed, but it's going to be male and female. So now I need, as I've already told you, we don't want seeds. So you're going to have to rogue out all of those male plants. And you want to do that before they start shedding pollen. Another consideration, some companies that have seed and, reasonably high quality seed, they have a $5,000 minimum purchase. So, you'd have 4 acres worth right off the bat. So those are things to consider. Bedding and drip, probably 500 an acre. That's a rough estimate. Fertility, I'm guessing if you're putting nitrogen fertilizer down, you might spend 100 an acre. And that kind of assumes that P and K are okay. I don't have questions on fungicides or pesticides. From a pesticide standpoint, you're probably looking at something like BT, because it's a it's a microbial product, so it would pass, I think, an organic standard. Labor, anywhere from $2,000 to $10,000 an acre, kind of what some different estimates I've seen or heard. I think 6 is probably in the range. So, you might have $15,000, $20,000 invested, and you're hoping that you're going to get a $30,000, $40,000 crop. So it's a potentially very high reward, but there's an awful lot of risk involved in this. And so, you just need to have your eyes open if you're going to go this route. Storage, again, I told you it's going to take a lot. And the hand processing, I could process about 8 plants per hour. So that means it would take me with 1,200 plants. Where did I get that? 12 to 15 hours. I don't think my math is right there. Like 120 to 150 hours per acre. So yeah, that's if one person's doing it. So you're going to need labor to get this stuff stripped out if you're hand processing it. There are other people that are looking at machine harvest. There are real questions about whether it will be a sufficient quality that the market will take it. So worth investigating. These are just a few plants of some grows from Virginia, or actually North Carolina last year. I was asked to provide this web link for any of you that's interested. And I can probably send that out since we weren't able to record this, apparently. But I was asked to provide that for an upcoming, I think it's Women in Hemp sort of effort. And I'm going to stop there. I'm going to take just a couple of questions. Somebody was asking about spacing on hemp plants for flowers. What we're typically looking at, again, is 1,200 per acre. So that's about 6 feet apart within a row and 6 feet apart between rows. But that's, that's going to kind of depend, I think, on the plant material you have and when you get it in the ground. If you're planting late, you might plant a little higher density just to try to compensate for the shorter growing season. Spacing change due to plant type. Yeah, and I think that's tried to hit on that. So some of these materials are shorter and bushier. Some of them are much bigger and widely spread. So that may affect your decision on planting. And you need, when you get seed or clones, you need to have some of those questions answered before you take that stuff to the field.
Tips for managing Johnson grass.
Tips for managing Johnson grass. My grad student here is saying pendimethalin is good for that. Again, nothing's labeled for any of this stuff. Yeah. So okay. I'm gonna stop there. I think we'll have a question about sea level and flood zones, an issue when considering your farm plan. Absolutely. You know, if you're going to be flooded, that's not going to help your hemp. And so, you know, if you can get it up, a location like that, you may be just advisable to plan to bed it, but even that may not be a guarantee if you're in that low a lying area. Any other questions?
Yeah, question on, is there a way to monitor THC levels on the farm during harvest?
Question about monitoring THC levels on farm. There are some cheap methods. I'm not sure that they're necessarily the most reliable or rigorous in terms of giving you a really well quantified value for THC. Many people are working with labs that will, you know, charge you somewhere between probably $70 and $100 a sample, but they're going out and sampling those flowers once they hit flower, and they're just doing that on a weekly basis. And as they are approaching the threshold, they say, okay, time to pull them. Typically, those labs will get the data back or the information back in about a week's time. Some have maybe faster turnaround than others. That will be critical as you get into this.
And do deer like hemp?
Do deer like hemp was a question. My experience, deer will sample hemp because I think it's strange or novel to them. And after they taste it a little bit, they say, nah, not interested. Aaron Williams.
And I think she can touch on this question. Do you have a list of buyers?
Yeah, there's a question for you probably. Do you have a list of buyers? And let's see here.
I do not.
Okay, Aaron does not. Aaron, I'm going to unshare, and I'm going to let you share your screen and take over.
All right. Let's see. All right. Can everyone see my industrial hemp green slide? I guess, Dr. Fike, can you see the slide?
You can stop sharing.
Well, I stopped sharing on mine, but I don't see yours yet, Aaron.
All right. Let's back out and make sure that I've got. Okay. That should do it.
I see you.
Yep. Okay. All right. Well, thank you all for the opportunity to talk to you about where the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services is as it pertains to our hemp program. So what I'll do quickly, because I want to be mindful of everybody's time this afternoon, we'll talk about, I'll touch on the farm bills and what they did relative to industrial hemp. We'll talk a little bit about Virginia's industrial hemp law. And then I'll go over some of the questions that I get most frequently, which likely some of you have or have already asked me. And then we'll look at kind of where we're going forward, and I'll touch briefly on some of the pending legislation that's before the Virginia General Assembly as we speak. So for the purposes of my presentation this morning, when I will use the term industrial hemp and hemp interchangeably, I'm not intending a distinction when I use those two different terms. It just depends on how I feel. The distinction for, as the law says, between industrial hemp and marijuana is it's all cannabis sativa. And as far as the law is concerned, industrial hemp has no more than 0.3% THC. As far as the law is concerned, anything over 0.3% THC is marijuana. As Dr. Fike has already touched on, industrial hemp can be grown for its grain, fiber, and floral cultivars, whereas marijuana is intended more for medicinal or recreational use. I've got a couple of pictures. Dr. Fike's already had some great pictures of the different varieties, but on the left there you'll see a fiber variety, and on the right you'll see a field growing a floral variety. So very different, obviously, operations there. Fiber and seed uses vary. This will kind of list some of the general uses for the stalk and uses for the seed. And when my agency started talking about hemp back in 2014, the industry nationally was looking at hemp cultivation for its stalk and its seed. Over the past few years, probably starting about 2016, the conversation has shifted to hemp cultivation for its floral material with a specific interest in the cannabidiol or the CBD that the flower produces. The 2014 Farm Bill is where recently the conversation started with hemp. So the 2014 Federal Farm Bill defined industrial hemp as being cannabis sativa with a THC concentration of not more than 0.3%. So that's where, when I say this is what the law says, that's where the law is. It's that Federal Farm Bill in 2014. The 2014 Farm Bill provided that you could grow hemp if you were growing hemp for research purposes in a state that had a law that allowed for it to be grown for research purposes. The 2018 Farm Bill has just been signed late December, and it has new hemp provisions, and it establishes a new definition for hemp, and it removes hemp from the definition of marijuana in the Federal Controlled Substances Act. The Farm Bill also establishes a regulatory framework for the commercial production of hemp. In order to, that regulatory framework is either under a state plan that the U.S. Department of Agriculture approves or under a federal plan that U.S. Department of Agriculture will establish. The Farm Bill also makes crop insurance and certain USDA programs and grants available to hemp farmers. And I'll get into the impact of the 2018 Farm Bill on Virginia's program in just a minute as I walk through my presentation. But generally, this is what we have on our website. It's available, obviously, for anybody to view. At this time, under the 2018 Farm Bill, my Department of Agriculture is exploring the next steps. So again, as I just mentioned, there has to be a plan submitted to USDA, or the cultivation is going to happen under a federal plan. Until either of those plans is in place, the existing law, the existing research programs that were established under the 2014 Farm Bill are going to remain in effect. So what does the law look like in Virginia? In response to the 2014 Farm Bill, the 2015 session of the Virginia General Assembly enacted the Industrial Hemp Law, and it created a research program that was overseen by my agency, but directly managed by public institutions of higher education. Under the law, you're allowed to possess hemp if you were licensed to grow for research purposes, and to get a license, you had to partner with a public institution of higher education. The summer of 2017, my agency convened a couple of meetings to talk to stakeholders about what their concerns were, what their thoughts were about the current program. And in response to the concerns we heard, we proposed some amendments with the governor's authorization to amend the Industrial Hemp Law to create a second research program that's directly managed by my agency, so that growers would not have to partner with universities who just simply don't have the resources to manage all of the interested producers in Virginia. So there's a second program through which people can grow hemp. Again, it's still a research program. The amendments in 2018 replaced the grower license with a grower registration, and we also added a hemp processor registration. The background check that was previously required was eliminated after hearing concerns from stakeholders, so that was just too burdensome of a requirement. So the General Assembly agreed to remove that background check requirement. We also amended the law to allow for a grower or his agent, or a processor or his agent, to possess industrial hemp for research purposes. Another concern we were hearing was that it was just too burdensome for every person working a crop, the hemp crop, to have to get a license. So under the current law, there would be one registered grower for a production field or a hemp field, and anybody working the crop could serve as that person's, or that person could document that those additional people are his agent. The law capped the registration application fee at $50. The law does currently allow my agency to set a minimum acreage for registration, but we're not planning to do that at this time. Some of the questions that I get a lot. So all of the 2018 amendments in this new research program went into effect July 1, 2018. So it's still kind of in its infancy. And we're also seeing, again, changes proposed to the law currently. So we're likely going to have to further modify the program. But once the law is enacted, then we'll figure out kind of what modifications are needed. But what generally I'm telling people is if you are interested in growing hemp in 2019, register under one of the research programs. Is there an application deadline for getting a registration? No, there's not. We are accepting applications and issuing registrations on a rolling basis. Right now it's taking about 75 days for us to process the registration applications due to the volume that we're receiving and due to the fact that it's just me right now. But I do have a new hemp program coordinator joining the agency in about 2 weeks, and so that should help us with processing our registration applications. Another question I get often is there a minimum or maximum acreage that I can grow or plant in hemp? There is neither. There's no restriction or limit. We do not have a limit on the number of registrations that we're allowed to issue. I also get asked about security requirements or fencing requirements, and the law does not establish any security requirements or fencing requirements. We do suggest that people think about where they're going to plant their crop, because we have had growers who've had their parts of their crop stolen, or they are aware that people have kind of wandered through their crop out of curiosity. So it's a good idea to keep your fields away from main roads, but it's not a requirement. I get questions about seed a lot. My agency doesn't have any planting seed to distribute to growers. I suggest people kind of network with growers in their area, other people growing hemp, and see if they have suggestions as to where to get seed or clones. Can you sell your crop, even though it's a research program? The federal law allows for market research, so market research is permissible. However, it depends on what you want to sell and who you want to sell it to, and there are some guidelines that are available on my agency's website in the Grower and Processor Registration Guide that's available there that outlines what can be sold and to whom. Another kind of type of question I get pertains to THC testing. The Virginia Industrial Hemp Law allows for my agency to conduct random THC testing, and at this point we are using a risk and random system to identify the production fields that we're going to sample. Pre-harvest testing is not required. There is no testing fee since we are doing this kind of on a random basis, so my agency is absorbing the testing, the cost of the testing. At this time, if a sample that we collect is over 0.3% THC, then you will be required to destroy that crop from which the sample was collected. I get a lot of questions about CBD oil. Under the current law, as it is today in Virginia, it's not clear that a registered grower or a registered processor who's participating in one of our hemp research programs is able to sell a hemp extract that contains CBD outside of the research program. So we are not issuing registrations to individuals who indicate that their only goal is to sell hemp extracts containing CBD to the general public. We do have researchers who are processing for CBD for a true research purpose, and that's permissible. However, that CBD product cannot leave the possession of a registered grower or a registered processor. I think this time I'll talk to you generally about some of the legislation that's pending before the General Assembly as we speak. There is House Bill 1839 that Delegate Marshall has introduced, and Senate Bill 1692 that Senator Ruff has introduced. They're companion bills, which means their provisions are the same. Those bills, I think, will help my agency respond to the 2018 Farm Bill. It kind of creates the framework within which it appears that the federal government wants the state to regulate hemp, and some of the provisions in those bills will hopefully address the gray areas that we have now with CBD production or hemp-derived CBD production. So I'm just going to touch on touching on that briefly today, just to kind of put it out there, put it on everyone's radar. But my agency hasn't yet kind of defined the modifications to our program that will likely be necessary in response to the pending legislation. Just a little bit of data on kind of how hemp production in Virginia has progressed. 2016 was the first year in recent history that hemp was planted. Well, it was the first year that hemp was planted under the university-led research program. In 2016, Virginia Tech, Virginia State University, and James Madison University all had research programs with my agency. They planted about 37 acres in hemp, and my agency issued 28 grower licenses. You'll see in 2017, the acreage increased to 78 acres planted in hemp, and we issued 34 grower licenses for the participants or the collaborators with the university-led research. This past growing season, we had Virginia Tech growing, Virginia State University, James Madison University, as well as University of Virginia. They planted 135 acres, although they had planned to plant about 250 acres total. With the weather that we had this past summer, the result was about 135 acres were planted. And my agency issued 85 grower licenses for participants in those research programs. So each university is working with private growers, and that's at the university's discretion and dependent upon the university's resources. Since July 1, when this second research program became effective, this is the research program that's led directly by my agency and is really more of a practical experience type of research program and is by no means intended to be university-level research. We have issued 125 grower registrations for participants in that research program, and we've issued 28 processor registrations. I expect in 2019 we'll have hemp grown in at least 68 localities based on just those 125 grower registrations that we've issued. That very briefly is how my agency started with its hemp program and where we are now. And again, where we expect to be going will be determined by the success of the legislation in Virginia that, again, is currently pending. And I believe I had a couple of questions that Dr. Fike sent me in advance. We had a question about a farm seed loans with crop insurance, and I don't have any information as to that. USDA is still kind of working to educate itself, I think, on hemp and get its new hemp program up and running. I do know that they are working to do that, but they have not yet put out any guidance about any of the hemp programs that they plan to stand up. I got a question about whether someone can sell their CBD flowers in Virginia. I think that's the question, and please let me know if I don't address it. But the flower material, if a grower sells it, the flower material needs to stay in the possession of someone who is registered to grow or registered to process hemp if it's in Virginia. That being said, I do know that there are growers who are planning to grow floral varieties or grow any hemp really, and planning to send it to an out-of-state processor because our processing infrastructure just isn't there yet. That, as far as my agency is concerned, will not jeopardize your grower or processor registration. So if you decide to send your crop across state lines, it's not something that would result in VDAX revoking your grower registration. And I'm kind of tap dancing around this kind of gray area as to the interstate transfer of hemp. I think the 2018 Farm Bill will help clarify that that interstate transfer is permissible, but it's not for me to say that that sale is okay, except for the fact that it's okay as far as your grower registration here in Virginia. So those are the questions I got in advance. Maybe Jabari has spotted any other questions that are specific to the law and the program. If you could just kind of tip me off, and I'll be happy to answer those. All right, let me scroll through the chat that I see and see if I can answer. So pesticides. So there's a question as to asking me to address pesticides, and I will say what I know my colleagues in the Office of Pesticide Services would say is that the label is the law. There, I believe, are a few products that have been labeled for hemp. I don't know specifically. I would defer those questions to the Office of Pesticide Services, and I don't know enough to know that if that use is permissible for everyone, or if there's just some special use permit that's been issued. I see a question about who the processors are. The industrial hemp law provides that any information submitted on a grower or processor application is proprietary, and I'm not able to give it out. However, we know that there's interest in finding out who's processing and who's doing what. So the processor application has a section on which the processor can basically waive that protection that the law provides for his or her information. So some processors have said, yes, VDAX, you can give out my name and contact information. Those individuals or those applicants who have said that and are listed on VDAX's hemp webpage. So there's a list of registered processors on our webpage who have said, feel free to share our information. Can I conduct out-of-state market research? I would send you to our grower and processor registration guide that, again, explains what you can sell and to whom, and touches on out-of-state purchasers as well.
Aaron?
Yes.
There was a question here about the varieties going over threshold, and I'll just say that we've had a variety of varieties that we looked at this past year. Certainly, probably a drop in the ocean relative to the number of available varieties out there. Some of those varieties we knew had some left-handed hemp parentage, as it were, and they came back hot. And others, interestingly enough, one in particular that I'm thinking about, a producer grew. It was a difficult growing environment, and that material that the producer grew went to seed. Now, when those plants grow to seed, not only is CBD low, but THC also is low. And so most of the seedy material that I've seen has been in the 0.15 to 0.2 range across the state. But in this case, that material went to seed and it was still, I think, up in the 2% range. So, probably higher level of THC than allowable, even though it was, a material that was not grown in the best of conditions or with the best of management. So, you need to be careful. There are a lot of people out there that will sell you a bill of goods in terms of material. There's no real guarantee. If you spend, thousands of bucks on plant material and then it comes in hot and they say it's not going to, there's no guarantee that, you're going to be able to have any recourse with those folks in most cases. Some brokers are providing clones or seed and saying, listen, I want you to grow this material under this circumstance. And I don't know if they have anything beyond that in their contract. So there's a question. Can hot hemp be addressed in the processing phase if proven to be reduced later? This is a point of discussion that Aaron and I have had on several occasions. And really, if you want to address this, I think the place to address it is not with me or with her or VDAX. The place to address this is with your state legislator. My sense is growers should not bear the burden of meeting the THC threshold simply because processors would provide a captive audience for VDAX to regulate. They're going to encompass the number of growers that are out there. So that material's got to come to a processor. Why does VDAX have to deal with 500 farmers when it could deal with 50 or 10 processors? And the processor has the capacity generally to blend these materials out so that they meet the threshold. Currently, that is not the arrangement. So the producer is on the hook to meet that THC threshold.
Correct. I would say at this point, again, VDAX has to operate under what the law provides. The law says that the THC concentration of hemp can be no greater than 0.3%. The products can have no greater than 0.3% THC. My agency doesn't get to change that line or change that percentage on our own. That's a legislative issue. I will say that you'll likely start to hear that, oh, Virginia's changed. There's now you can do 0.6 or now you can do 1%. The two bills that I mentioned that are pending before the General Assembly do provide some tolerance and provide the ability for VDAX to respond differently when the THC concentration of the plant is over 0.3%. That being said, those provisions don't go into place until VDAX has a USDA-approved plan. So again, remember under the 2018 Federal Farm Bill, it authorizes states that want primary regulatory authority over hemp production in the state to submit a plan to USDA. The plan has to touch on like 5 or 6 different things. Where we have to have a plan for knowing where the hemp is being grown. We have to have a plan for responding to hemp grown in violation of the law. We have to be able to enter into corrective action plans with growers. So if we present an enforcement response that, as the bills currently provide, between 0.3 and 0.6, if your hemp tests somewhere between 0.3 and 0.6, we can't require destruction. If your hemp tests between 0.6 and 1%, you can request a resample and a retest before VDAX can require destruction. The thought is that VDAX could put those enforcement provisions into a plan that it submits to USDA. If USDA approves that plan, then that's the framework under which we can operate. until then, we're still working with that 0.3% THC limit. And again, it's like Dr. Fike said, it's not something that he can fix. It's not or change. It's not something that I can change. That's established in the law. Any other specific question, Jabari or Dr. Fike, that you see that I should respond
We
to?
have one question. Do growers have to notify VDACs when plants are in flower since testing is random?
You do not have to notify us at this time. What I plan to do going forward is to ask growers to submit harvest reports in advance of when they plan to harvest so that then we can know where to send our inspectors. But as of today, no, there's not the expectation that growers will tell us when their plants have flowered.
Are there other questions for me or for Ms. Williams?
Can I use my neighbor's greenhouses?
There was a question, Aaron, there was a question about could somebody use their neighbor's greenhouse to grow if their neighbor doesn't have a license? And I suppose that what you would do is you would say that person's your agent and you would list that greenhouse site in your listing of locations for your grow. Is that correct?
Right. If you're a registered grower and you want to grow in your neighbor's greenhouse, that greenhouse most definitely needs to be listed on your grower registration. Your neighbor could be your agent. The law doesn't define what agent is, but we do recommend that you, registered grower, provide documentation to any of your agents so that they can receive the protection under the law from from prosecution under the criminal code. There's a form available on VDAC's website that Jabari shared the link to. The form is an agent documentation form that doesn't need to come to VDAC. That's just something that a registered grower can use to document for his or her agent that there is a relationship there. But right, I would say if you're going to plant something in your neighbor's yard, you need to you definitely need to have that site listed on your registration.
Okay, please restate the legalities regarding THC and testing.
Some people also
There was a connection drop at that point.
Okay, so let's go back here. VDAC, the law allows us to do random THC testing. We're testing to make sure that what you're growing is industrial hemp. Industrial hemp can have no more than 0.3% THC. If your sample that we collect tests over 0.3% THC, you have to destroy that crop. The other pieces that I went into related to the 0.3 to 0.6, 0.6 to 0.6 to 1%. I don't want to get into all over again because again that's pending legislation, and I don't want to confuse the issue. I mean, at this point, we're working with 0.3%, and anything over would need to be destroyed.
Okay. So I'm just trying to go through some of the questions here. There was somebody was asking about the Women in Hemp event. I think that is Saturday, hosted by Lily Hemp, and I may be able to get that. Jabari's put a link up there for that, I think. So,
what part of the plant is sampled for determination?
Yeah, what part of the plant sampled? So that, Aaron, I'll let you take that.
Sure. Our inspectors are following protocol that require that they sample the 3 to 5 inches, the top 3 to 5 inches of the terminal bud on female plants that are in flower.
Can growing conditions affect THC levels in the plant? Yes. That's kind of what we understand. The longer those plants go, the more CBD yield you have, but THC kind of follows CBD. You're using some of the same enzyme pathways to generate those cannabinoids, but there's some evidence that environmental stressors can help those plants have higher concentrations, which can be a challenge.
Can you recommend a flower variety?
Can I recommend a flower variety? I'm probably not in the best position to do that for a few reasons. There's a lot of people out there that want to sell flowers. I've had a few that I've tested, some that I probably really can't speak about at this point. There are, again, a number of companies out there that, so if I feel like if I say this is one you should go get versus the one I don't mention that maybe I'm just not aware of, I don't really want to play. I'm not in a place where I think I'm in the business of kind of directing you one direction or another. And until there's more dollars behind that kind of research and support for it, I just don't feel that I'm well versed or positioned to do it. We've looked mostly at productivity, had less ability to look at CBD simply because of the cost. We have some understanding of what some of these plants will do from a THC standpoint because VDAX has done that. But, we're facing the same struggles in terms of trying to do a research program without any strong support to be able to give you more information on some of that anyway. So I'd rather you do it on your own, do your own research on that. And if you're willing to share, I'd be happy to hear what kind of experience you had. Will VCE, will Cooperative Extension, add hemp to the commercial growers manuals? Good question. We do get a lot of questions about what are soil fertility and soil recommendations, that sort of thing. We may be able to do that down the road. I don't think we've got enough good data for that right now, which is why we're simply saying fertility similar to corn. Somebody asked about planting dates. Again, for these kind of broad acre row crop style plantings for fiber or grain, you're typically talking earlier. If you're looking for flowers, you're more generally talking sometime in June to, some people I've seen plant in July. It's not ideal, but it can be done. Let's see here, other questions.
So I see some questions about being an agent and locations for hemp. So I see a question about being an agent, but not having the registered grower not having a registration with the coordinates. Then that registered grower should not be growing hemp at that location until he or she has a registration that has those coordinates. Go ahead.
Well, there's different, so you keep on with that.
Okay. Let's see, there's a question about using a home address if you're planning to grow in a greenhouse and whether it needs to be in a location agriculturally zoned. So my agency's position on that is your use of your land needs to comply with the zoning ordinances in your locality. We don't figure that out when we issue registrations, but if you are registered to grow on a production field, that production field needs to be, that use of that production field land needs to be in compliance with your zoning ordinance. The same would apply for a processing facility.
There's a question, Aaron, about can registration application be amended after approved?
Yes.
Okay.
If you decide that you need to change your production field, I cannot issue a registration without production field coordinates. So you need to put something on your application. And I understand that can change as you get closer to the growing season and plans change. At this point, in order to change your registration coordinates or the production fields associated with your registration, you need to send me an email and tell me what production field you want taken off your registration and provide me with the information for the production field that you want added to your registration. So I need the coordinates for the field, I need the square footage or the acreage for that location, and then kind of a general description. If you can't provide an address would be best. If you can't provide an address, kind of a general description as to where that location is. Provide that to me in an email, and you'll go in the queue of other people who have asked for changes to their registration. And then once I'm able to issue the registration with the changed locations, then then you're cleared to grow at the new spot.
Aaron, the question is, if I'm listed as an agent, but the registered grower doesn't have the modified paper with added coordinates, am I legal to obtain the material for that location?
The short answer is no.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
There was a question about canine units from somebody, and here's the deal, folks. If you're going to grow this stuff, you should probably go ahead and invite your local law enforcement in just to have that conversation with them. They may or may not be pleased, and that's their own personal issue, but you really, frankly, want them on your side because you may be a target. We had wine grapes stolen in Montgomery County here, probably to the tune of $50,000 worth this fall. And you'd hate to walk out one day to your beautiful little hemp trees and they're all gone. So invite local law enforcement in, give them a cookie, tell them there's any sort of hemp in it, just foster those relationships, because I think you'll want them to be aware of and comfortable with what's going on. And I hope you don't need their assistance, but it may be possible that you're going to need them in dealing with other folks who would like to take what you've worked hard on and take that for free. So
somebody said that they did.
And I'll add that my agency is required to notify law enforcement in the localities where hemp's going to be grown or processed. We also have to notify state police. So we're making that notification. We're at this point a bit delayed in notifying each locality, but state police has an up-to-date list of all registered growers and registered processors in Virginia as of the day that the registrations are issued. So they're getting the notification from us. And from what I understand, that yes, canine dogs will alert to hemp because they are, that's just how they're trained. They're trained for the scent of cannabis. So they're not trained to be able to distinguish between THC concentrations. So they will alert to hemp. The field test kits that law enforcement uses will test positive for when they are testing hemp, because again, those test kits are just testing for the presence of a cannabinoid. So even if you I've seen the field test kits show a positive result for pure CBD. So it's just the reality of the resources that law enforcement has available to them. So that being said, you are best served to have all documentation that with you if you are in possession of your crop or your product, documentation showing that you are registered to grow or process, or you are an agent of someone who's registered to do that.
So 2 more questions, Aaron. One is, if somebody wants to grow for their own personal use, do they register both as a grower and a processor?
I would say, I've gotten the question before, and I think at this point, if you're not planning to acquire plant material from other growers to process, you're just processing your own plant material, and you're not then sharing that product with any other person, then a grower registration is sufficient.
So,
but certainly required if you're going to grow the plant.
Yeah, there's another question here about the process for annual review of existing registrations.
The process. So the registrations are it's a yearly, an annual registration process. Your registration will last for a year from the date on which we issue the registration, and there will be a renewal application available that will collect the information that's needed to issue a registration. So do not assume that because you're registered this year, you're fine for next year. We still need to collect that same production field information so that we know what you're planning to do in the next calendar year.
So one person made a comment on the law side of this thing, that they had given full information to the local authorities and they still got searched. So again, this gets back to personalities and personal opinions about this. In my opinion, that's what's happening there. So I think, just because you told your local law enforcement officers what you were doing doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be happy or comfortable about that. And that's why, again, I would encourage you to invite them out to your property if you can, to just kind of help make them more comfortable. They may still search you, but they might smile at you when they're doing it. I don't know. So let's see here. Somebody's asking me about forages and cut flowers, and can we speak to those topics, please? On the forages side, there are some folks that are looking at this as a crop that could be grown, sort of maybe turned into something like a hay, harvested, or maybe a silage. Again, these are fiber crops, so they do have a lot of fiber in them. Getting them at the right time of the season would be important. And I think that we may have better alternatives. I do think there may be some other uses in forage and livestock production systems, but I don't have the research data to back up my hunches, so I don't want to go on that. Question about, can we use this as cut flowers? And yeah, you probably could sell these as a cut flower. And
I would say if you might be able to, it would not be permissible.
Okay. Thank you. I sit corrected.
And I will. That's because that is a part of the plant that needs to stay in the possession of a registered grower or a registered processor or one of those people's agents.
Yeah. Okay. One other question about. Oh shoot! I just had it here. Yeah, now I'm losing my mind. Crop insurance, and I guess under the 2018 Farm Bill, it will be insurable. Is that correct?
The Farm Bill has provisions related to crop insurance, and I don't know much more than that, other than I expect USDA will put out some guidance soon.
So the Virginia law changes, what's the relationship between Virginia's law and the 2018 Farm Bill if Virginia doesn't get any changes made? Does that affect crop insurance?
Okay, so if there are no changes to Virginia's law, I don't know whether.
Well, I mean, it was.
I don't know enough to know whether that would affect the crop insurance availability that's authorized under USDA.
Federally administered program, right? So
right. I think so.
Program, it ought to be possible, but you probably want to have that discussion with whoever your insurer is. Let's see, 2 new messages. 2019 sales closing for crop insurance is March 15th. If USDA has not declared hemp an insurable crop by that date, no federal crop insurance. Thanks, Stephen. At least in 2019.
I saw a question earlier about kind of the time frame for USDA's implementation and then VDAC's submission of a plan to USDA. At this point, I don't have a reliable time frame. We're hopeful that USDA will put out some guidance soon as to what they expect in these plans that we have to submit. The Farm Bill requires that the Department of Agriculture consult with the governor and the chief law enforcement officer in the state on the plan that's ultimately submitted to USDA. So, I mean, generally VDAC's, my thought is, and this is unofficial, I can't say that this is definitively what the agency plans, but as the hemp coordinator for the agency, I expect when we get USDA guidance, my agency will be able to generate a plan and have the conversations with the governor's office, the required conversations with the governor's office and state police, and then soon thereafter be able to submit a plan. But have we submitted a plan this time? No, USDA is not accepting plans right now.
So we're at 12:01, and first I have to apologize. I thought because it was coming off my site that all I had to do was hit the recording button, but apparently I had to claim the ownership, and so we did not get this recorded. For those of you who are interested, I am having a session for extension agents next week, and we should be able to get that recorded now that I know better. And much of this information will be covered there again to help with extension agents deal with that. Oh, somebody else says they have a full recording. If you would send me a copy of that link or however you got it, I would appreciate it so that we can get that more broadly distributed. That'd be very helpful. I'd like everybody you can clap silently for Ms. Williams. She's been a very big help for this program and has worked for a long time, by herself largely to get these things done. So we greatly appreciate all the assistance and effort that she's made. I appreciate your time, and I'm sure there will be more questions as you have them. Again, probably better to send them through your agent, so it's easier for me to kind of accumulate them that way than to deal with 45 emails from individuals each day. So with that, we'll say have a good afternoon. Thank you for your time. And if I can be helpful to you in the future, again, I'd be happy to do that. Start with your agents first. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.